Hello, I'm Deborah Malone, founder of The Internationalist and host of Internationalist Marketing TV. Today's guest is Tim Love, author, former vice chairman of Omnicom, and online safety advocate. Tim, it is always a pleasure to see you, and it's particularly a pleasure in that we're at a milestone right now. Your latest award-winning book is now 18 months old, and I think you're finding a lot of new relevance and new meaning associated with your Discovering Truth journey, especially regarding the dangers, unfortunately, of social media. So with that, let me say welcome to the show.
Thank you, Deborah. I appreciate your wanting to talk about this and reminding me that it's been 18 months.
I know time does go quickly.
Wow.
Maybe not as quickly as it or as slowly as it did during COVID, but it certainly goes
Yeah.
quickly. So anyway, let's start. I set it up with certainly you've learned more new things and found new meaning, but just tell us, let's start by talking a little bit about how the book refocused your interests.
Well, first of all, Discovering Truth has gotten more relevant, it seems, each day since we published the book. And I would say that there's three areas or two new areas that it's broadened my focus. I started off by trying to understand how people discern truth. It was that simple. I wasn't going to be an arbiter of truth. I was simply going to apply use my area of expertise, which is advertising and persuasion, to analyze how people discern truth. And what's evolved out of that is a deeper learning than I expected of new things that are being written and discussed because of the internet, because the internet is a relatively new media. And the two areas that are most relevant, as I'm seeing and at this time, are child safety is a big concern and a big area as our use of the internet has reached 92% of households. And now we have a computer in the palm of your hand. And then the other area of concern or safety would be national security. So I started out looking for truth, how we discern it. I've gotten more into child safety because of the penetration of the internet, and then national security. And national security has been a very interesting area that I'm feeling is only now starting to be written about. They're starting to have consumers hear more about this because, frankly, we just didn't know how open our internet was to foreign and domestic adversaries.
Well, let's start with one of them. I know that you're very much concerned about how social media can negatively affect the lives of young people. And this has certainly been brought to the mainstream through brands like Dove. They've done an amazing job. And also much publicized debates, legislation, and even fines regarding safety, particularly with a number of the platforms. So what do you believe is actually the biggest issue that kids face now?
Well, I believe it's that there's no oversight of the content that is being distributed to them unwittingly by their by algorithms that are based on what the kids' interests are. I'm concerned that the two chief concerns for child safety are screen time, and that we say screen time because it's not just the internet screen time. The internet and the television have come together for young users. And screen time is an issue because they're spending time not engaging with other human beings face to face. And there's more and more research coming out about how that is not beneficial to brain development in young people. Jonathan Haidt, psychologist from NYU, has written a book called The Anxious Generation, and it really does summarize some of the harms that are happening. The other issue is really one that's you're going to hear more and more. It's already started, is about content moderation, content oversight. And there's two ends of the spectrum that the average American is starting to hear about. One is this tension between censorship, freedom of speech, and of course the platforms don't want to yield on this idea of having to have oversight of user content, because they're currently protected by the Communication Act of 1996, which is a bit old and a bit out of date. And I can speak
And
a
it
little bit
also
more about.
defines them. It also defines them differently. It doesn't necessarily define them in a way that other may be
Yes,
defined. So
yes, it
that may be
defines
a
them
challenge. Yeah.
like telephone companies, like telephone service. You wouldn't expect to have your phone calls with your dear friends or your associates have advertising in it. And so it was set up originally because it was assumed that it would be a subscription model like telephone service, but instead it's developed and flourished because of advertising. And the Senate Judiciary Report's primary argument was that the advertising is not going enough to certain sites, and they want more spending because they want more revenue. They've made a decision to protect profits instead of safety.
No, I know that's a very complex issue, and it's one that fortunately there's some discussion going on. I'm not sure that action is taking place quickly enough, but I would love to go back to some of the things that you said about children and online safety. You are actually now involved with an organization called MAMA, or Mothers Against Media Addiction.
Yes.
Interestingly, early in your career, you also worked with MAD, or Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And while, I know there's quite a number of decades in between, and certainly the advocacy groups have very different issues and intentions. Just talk about some of the similarities and maybe a little bit more about MAMA, because that may not be as well known.
Okay. I want to go back to something you said about the complexity and try and see if this helps make it a little simpler for our viewers. I believe in free speech. I believe that we should be able to stand on a street corner and say anything we want. And I can go to a town park and stand on a soap crate and espouse ideas and things that whatever I want. But if somebody came up to me with a microphone and put the microphone in front of me while I'm talking, they become a distributor. Okay, so that's what the platforms are currently set up to, and how they're defined legally. They're distributors of content. The issue is the distributor changes from distributor to publisher when they start selling advertising in my speech. So if they bring the mic up, they're a distributor, and they're protected as a distributor by the Communication Act of 1996. But when they start selling advertising and making money on my content, then they are a publisher. And every media, from magazines to radio to television, and now we're confronting this with the internet, has this issue of how do you treat the provider of the content. And in my opinion, it's time to treat them as publishers. and they have to have some editorial oversight. And okay, so Mama is an organization that there's several organizations that have been started by parents, and I'll say mothers, but both parents have been involved, of people who have lost children due to things that those children experienced while using the internet. Some examples, and these are happening more every day, and these parents are completely frustrated because they've been out to Silicon Valley. They've met with the platforms, all of them. The platform people they met with were very sympathetic, and some even cried when they heard these stories. But nothing's happened because the mothers go back, or the parents, and look at the internet and still see this material still being propagated, and they still see kids dying. So one of the things that they're talking about is that kids are dying while ads are buying. The ads are paying for this material to be exposed to their children. Some examples: a woman had three children. She lost her youngest child because her youngest child saw what's called a choking challenge on the internet, and the choking challenge is also called a suffocation challenge. It's or pass out challenge, and it's challenging the child or the viewer or user to try and almost suffocate themselves and have a euphoric experience from this close jeopardy of their breathing and life. Other ones are a rampant amount of kids who have tried to acquire drugs like what things that keep them awake so they can study, and because there's a lot of pressure on the kids to do well in school. And as they order some of these drugs to improve their focus and their, Adderall and different things, Xanax, they're being shipped by illegal internet users who have laced them with fentanyl. And these unassuming kids are buying this over the internet without their parents knowing, and end up unwittingly killing themselves. This is a real problem. It's not an isolated event. We're also seeing that grandparents are starting to get more involved in this because they have become aware of the problem. A third example of the kind of thing that we hear about is a young kid was being bullied, and his sense of self-worth. And you mentioned the Dove program for Unilever, which is remarkable. And my hat is off to AC Eggleston and the marketing people at Unilever for bringing this forward, because it deals with the diminishment of self-worth and self-esteem that can happen when you're bullied by people whose opinions you value, people you go to school with, and so forth. And one child used AI recently to find out how to commit suicide and was successful. The last one that I want to talk about is a gentleman named Andy Parker, who I did a podcast with several years ago. Andy lives in Virginia. His daughter was a journalist and was doing a television interview in front of a mall during the week in the morning with a cameraman. And as they were reporting from the mall and the weather and what a lovely day it was, a crazed gunman came and murdered his daughter and the cameraman. And the video material from that live broadcast is still being placed on the internet on various platforms. He has tried and tried and tried. This happened in 2015. That was 9 years ago. And this man should not have to be subjected to the platforms continuing to air this stuff. He's gone to the government, he's testified in Washington, and yet nothing is happening. And that to me is just wrong. It can be taken down, and it can be, you can use AI to take a lot of this material down. A fifth area is the foreign influence that we're seeing coming across the internet from ISIS. And the ISIS stuff is very noticeable because it uses the ISIS flag, and AI should be able to identify the flag. So this is a real problem. It's not an isolated thing. And the focus on children is something that most people can agree with. And that's why there's a similarity between Mothers Against Drunk Driving and Mothers Against Media Addiction, because the kids are most vulnerable. They don't realize what's happening. And in the case of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, drinking was always a problem in America. It has alcohol in it, and we had prohibition, and we had an ongoing social issue about alcohol consumption in this country. It's been with us as long as there's been alcohol. But it wasn't until there was an increase in drunk driving issues, and drinking and driving is illegal. So the context for Mothers Against Drunk Driving was consumers, the providers of alcohol, that would be the liquor market, or what's called beverage alcohol manufacturers. Then there was another dimension, which was on-premise, meaning bars and restaurants were involved in this, and also off-premise, which would be a private party where you have people over. But there was a legal context for it. And the legal context was that it's against the law to drink and drive, at a certain level. So after years and years of this problem, the focus became on young people driving, first-time new drivers, and driving drunk. And Mothers Against Drunk Driving was able to get more attention because it was more relevant. In the case of the kids platforms, there's Fair Play as an organization, there's Mama, and you have in both cases, they're focusing on the consumer as children. The platforms are part of the focus because of user content and the presence of illegal content. So the context is there is illegal content, but the Communication Act of 1996 absolves the platform of any legal liability for content. They require in Section 230 that the platform will operate on a Good Samaritan basis. And so you'll find that the platforms do some screening and some taking down of content, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to the problems. And there should be no doubt that we need to protect children.
You've been looking at this issue for a while, and I know with some great emotion and certainly great intensity. Is there a way forward regarding these social media issues affecting children and teens? Is it limiting screen time, as Mama would suggest? Is it specific education in school? Is it only the legislation? I mean, there has to be a rational way forward.
Yes, the legislation is definitely our Communication Act is antiquated. Today, the internet is at 92% of U.S. households, and about 72% of the world's population can go online. So it's a very different context. And we've changed our Communication Act in the past. Like this is an example of what we learn from history is we don't learn from history. Number one is the first Communication Act was set up in 1927. It was called the Radio Act because it was a new media and they felt that it needed to have some oversight. And there were abuses being taken by radio operators without any oversight for standards and so forth. It grew by advertising, and then television happened. And when television first came on the scene and these abuses from radio were being alarming, in 1934, America changed the Radio Act to the Communication Act of 1934. And that's when the FCC, Federal Communication Commission, was brought in to work in tandem with the media as partner. That act of 1934 lasted until 1996 when the internet showed its face, but we haven't gone back and examined it. And one of the reasons we haven't gone back and examined it is the power of the a few tech internet providers that have tremendous power in terms of capturing data on their users and selling that data. And they don't want to have to do this because it could limit their audience size and it will cost money. My proposal is that another thing we should learn from history is how have we done this in the past. And it's been the cost to do this oversight has always been built into the cost of buying the advertising. Some of the things you mentioned already about encouraging limiting screen time, you're seeing that happen. Schools are now deciding that you shouldn't be able to use your smartphone during school hours or on the premise of the school. And the best way I heard this explained was by Julie Scelfo, who's the founder of Mama. And she said, you know, when you pack your kids' lunch for school, you don't put in there a gambling voucher. You don't put in a magazine about pornography or pictures of pornography. And you don't put in games that they can play and tell them to go off to school and have a good day and study hard. She said, but what we're doing is we're sending them off to school with that capability to gamble, to receive content, to be completely vulnerabilized in the palm of their hand. And it's very disruptive to their learning and disruptive to their ability to learn how to operate around other children. Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about encouraging independence of kids, fostering real life social skills through face-to-face activities. You know, there's some of the schools have stopped doing phys ed like they used to. So kids aren't getting a chance to play kickball like they used to. And he's also recommending that they create safe places for discussion because the kids are spending a lot of time in their bedrooms by themselves and being inundated by potentially brutal bullying. He talks about there needs to be a balance between protection and freedom. And that's what we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation. There's a tension between protection and freedom. America has always found a way to do this balance between protection and freedom because the content is enabled through advertising.
Now, I know that you've given us a lot of history. You've given us a lot of examples, many from past decades and different generations. And you do say something quite alarming, which is kids are dying while advertisers keep buying. You recently did an open letter to the industry and you called for adopting something with more initials, which is COSA, as opposed to CARU, which is the Kids Online Safety Act. And that certainly has been in the news quite a bit. And you suggested that not only should it be adopted, you also called for a new Communications Act, which you've clearly explained. So as we close, let me just ask you two things. Is there any comment that you'd like to make about COSA? And then maybe, perhaps more importantly for the industry, do you think what should be next for self-regulation, which has been something that, many associations have championed before there can be legislation. And that may be an important question to answer now that we've recently seen the loss of GARM, and maybe you have some suggestions on how it might be done differently.
Yes, I'll try and be. GARM was a very noble idea. It was everything you just said. It was an attempt to, based on our history of the industry, to have some method of oversight for content and safety. Major advertisers got involved with it. It was launched at the Cannes Advertising Festival and eventually presented to the World Economic Forum in 2019. And I was very hopeful and applauded this effort because it also included the platforms. Not all of them, but Twitter was there, and Google, and Meta, which was Facebook at the time. And they came together and said that they were going to try and provide some method of first setting up standards for content, and then a method of monitoring it and reporting on it. And unfortunately, the data that was used was provided by the platforms. And the platforms, as I said in the earlier part of this conversation, it's not like they're not doing anything, but they're doing a very bare minimum because the Communication Act said they're going to operate as on a Good Samaritan basis. I don't know how you measure that. Do you measure it with one good deed or complete removal of illegal drug content? So they do take things down. And as you've seen, in some instances, when they've taken some content down and some individuals, like after the January 6th event, there's been an outcry from freedom of speech advocates and censorship, including the ACLU. It's a strange collection of bedfellows there, but we've crossed this bridge before, and we've had ways of improving it. So what COSA is, Kids Online Safety Act, there's really two acts that are being proposed and have been knocked around in Congress for the last 2 years. One is Kids Online Safety Act, COSA, and the other is called COPPA, which is COPPA, and that's the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And that basically is saying they don't want their kids' data to go into the hands of these big companies who sell that data to users so that they can understand and reach their children better. And that was recently approved in the Senate and now goes to Congress. I hope that we can get together to protect our children. But if we can't get our Congress together to protect our children, we're in big trouble. So that's COSA and that's COPPA, and which makes the bar for changing the Communication Act of 1996 rather high. How do we get that changed? And the platforms don't want to change anything. And what's different from the early days of television and radio is the amount of people whose lives are touched by internet platforms and internet revenue. The stock market is largely gauged for everybody who has a 401k plan has some tech stock in it. And corporations of any kind are working very closely with the tech firms for their own information data gathering. So we're more conflicted than we were with television and radio. And I think an education process has to happen because it seems pretty clear that people don't want our children to be harmed. And I think there's an increasing amount of people that realize that we're being played as a country through a divide and conquer strategy on the internet, because our internet is wide open to foreign and domestic adversaries. Our television wasn't like that. Our radio wasn't like that. Our radio was like it until the Radio Act of 1927 and the Communication Act of 1934, because they saw what Germany was doing using our content. And the other things that we changed in those days with little argument was the need for Voice of America on radio. And right now we have Voice of China, Voice of Russia, and the average American doesn't notice it because they expect it to be in Russian or Chinese, and it's not. Looks like it's created by an American. There's been well documented the Russian troll farms and the Chinese, and more recently you're hearing about Iraq attempts at hacking into the Democratic and Republican committees. So this is real, and the average person doesn't see it. And it's sort of like, how do you have people understand that this is real? I believe you start by having them understand the vulnerability and harms that are coming to children. They're very apparent.
Well, you express it well. You make the comparisons, you make the arguments. It's the conversation we've had today is quite sobering, particularly if one is from the industry. But you do make some points about some of the things that might be possible. And I do think that maybe starting with children is a wonderful way forward, because it's one of those areas that no one can argue with. However, I have one other suggestion for you as we close. Perhaps maybe your next book should be
I don't know
on just this very subject. So with that, we'll keep talking about this, and we'll keep trying to get the word out. So yeah. Tim, thanks so much. It's always enlightening to talk.
I'd like to put one plug in and have people go to the MAMA website and see some of the activities that they're doing and some of the progress that they're making. And if you really want to understand this issue of how internet is troublesome for your children or your grandkids, Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, is worth a read.
Well, it wouldn't be a conversation with an advertising executive if there wasn't a plug or two. But anyway, they are certainly well-meaning. So again, Tim, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Deborah.
The Internationalist focuses on the continual reinvention of marketing by highlighting inspirational marketers around the world and their ideas as they move the industry forward. Internationalist Marketing TV shares these perspectives through interviews and personal stories. Thanks so much for watching. If you find this kind of content helpful, please click like or subscribe. Again, thanks so much.